Hi everyone, my name is Corie and I'm helping you read through the Bible this year. Today we are doing a chapter by chapter recap of all our assigned reading from Bible Discovery TV, and our Bible Discovery Guide. So, our assigned reading for this week covers Lamentations chapter 4 to Ezekiel chapter 20. Really interesting images in store for us today. So let's get you caught up on your reading. Lamentations chapter 4, this book is believed to have been written by the prophet Jeremiah. It is a response to the destruction of the city of Jerusalem, so the fall of Judah, the country, and the destruction of the Jerusalem temple as well. So Lamentations chapter 4, in this chapter, the destruction of Jerusalem is spoken of specifically with vivid descriptions of the results of the siege of the city. So starvation, a lot of death, and even cannibalism of the dead, is spoken of here in Lamentations chapter 4. It also connects the destruction of Jerusalem to the corruption of the priests and the prophets of the people. It likens the priests and prophets to the blind and unclean. Now, why this is a striking comparison when you think about it is that the prophets are those who claimed to see more than just the physical world. They didn't just have 20/20 vision. These people could see the spiritual world. They claimed to see it, and this chapter calls them blind. And then the priests, they're those who claimed to be holy, set apart, a different class of people dedicated to God, and yet here they're called so unclean that even the people living in the squalor of a besieged city despise them. They tell them to go away because they're just too unclean for them. So there's a reversal, a role reversal, and some irony going on here in Lamentations chapter 4. Also, at the end of the chapter, there is a direct address to Edom. So directly speaking to the nation of Edom to stop rejoicing over Jerusalem's fall because she's next. She is also going to be destroyed by Babylon. That brings us to the last chapter in Lamentations, chapter 5. So this is a direct call to God by the people, by the exiles, by the survivors of this tragedy, for God to save them, for God specifically to remember them. Now, this phrase, God remembered them, or God, please remember us, it's used often of God's action. I mean, you just think probably to the most famous use of it back in the time period of the Exodus, where it says God remembered the Israelites, and that's what prompted him God remembered Abraham and his promise. And that's what prompted him to get Moses to go back to the Israelites. So this phrase, and God remembered them, isn't trying to communicate to us that God has a bad memory, that his short-term memory is not that great. That's not what this is trying to imply. It's not as if God actually forgot the people in that sense. It's that it's as if God has forgotten us because he's not acting on our behalf. He's acting like we are a forgotten people. So by asking God to remember them, it wasn't like, oh, just remember my name, remember all the good times we've had. It's no, remember us, act on our behalf. So there's this active engagement in helping, restoring, and fixing. So that's what the people are calling for here. And then it also describes some of the hardships and the atrocities, the war crimes, essentially what we would call today war crimes, experienced by the captured Judeans. Okay, that is the end of Lamentations. Not a happy book by title and content, but now we are moving on to Ezekiel. So Ezekiel brings us back before the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple just a little bit. The prophet Ezekiel was taken in the first wave of exiles to Babylon. So this is while Jerusalem still stands. Okay, so in Ezekiel chapter 1, the prophet is 30 years old. That's believed that's what that introduction means. And Again, he's a Judean exile taken in the first wave. So back when King Jehoiachin was deposed and taken to Babylon, if you're remembering your history, and King Zedekiah was set up in Jerusalem as king. So Ezekiel has a vision of the throne of God, but it's a mobile throne of God. It's not like static sitting in heaven somewhere. This is often referred to today as the chariot throne of God because it's moving around. There's wheels that are all-seeing wheels that are on the ground that are a part of these 4 living creatures that we're going to find out later are also called cherubim. And then the body proper of the cherubim are described as being human in form. They've got human bodies, but they have 4 faces. A man, a lion, an ox, and an eagle. And each of them also have 4 wings. With 2 of their wings, they cover their body, and with 2 of their wings, they fly. And we're told that they fly in a square formation. So each of their 2 wingtips touch each other. So it makes like a square formation with 1 on each side. Over top of the cherubim, there is a vault that is described as crystal-like, and on top of the vault, there is a throne that's described to be like the precious stone lapis lazuli. And then on the throne is God in human form, but not described like humans, so glowing and all of these really interesting things. Okay, so this chapter ends with Ezekiel falling on his face when he finally sees this form of the glory of God. Now, there's a couple points of significance that I want to draw out before we move on. First is that God is mobile. The throne of God is mobile. Now, this reinforces what we've been hearing from all the prophets, including Ezekiel's contemporary prophet, who just lived in a different country, right? Ezekiel lived in exile. Jeremiah lived in Jerusalem. Jeremiah was talking about, the temple is going to be destroyed. It's essentially been decommissioned. God has left it. And then Ezekiel gets this vision of the throne of God not being static in the temple, but he's actually moving. Okay, so it reinforces this idea that the temple has been decommissioned. God is also described as coming from the north, which is really interesting because coming from the north in Jeremiah's book is always associated with the enemy, Babylon, coming to destroy Jerusalem and Judah. Okay, Ezekiel chapter 2, God helps Ezekiel stand up, because remember he fell flat on his face, and God calls Ezekiel to be a prophet at this point, and he sends Ezekiel specifically, he goes, you have a specific audience, and that is the children of Israel, the rebellious Israelites. And he gives them some commands. Don't be afraid of the Israelites, and don't be rebellious like the Israelites. And then God hands a scroll to Ezekiel, and he says, eat this. And on the scroll are words of lamenting, mourning, and weeping. And that's the end of chapter 2. Ezekiel chapter 3, he eats the scroll and it tastes like honey. And then he's told to go speak to Israel specifically, again, not to foreigners. And there's a note in here, surely the foreigners would listen to you, but Israel's probably not going to. So there's a little bit of sarcasm thrown in there. And then God takes Ezekiel up with his chariot throne and brings him back to the exiles at the Kibar River, where he first fell into this vision. God lets Ezekiel know, this is a serious responsibility. You have to deliver. If I give you a warning for a people, you have to give them that warning. Otherwise, their blood's going to be on your hands. But if you give them the warning and they don't heed it and they die anyway, their blood is not on your hands because you did your job in warning them. God tells Ezekiel also to go to somewhere called the plain, so probably out of the city, go to the plain. So he does, and he sees the glory of God again. And the result of that vision is that Ezekiel is told to go into seclusion in his home until God opens his mouth by giving him a message. Ezekiel chapter 4. All right. Ezekiel the prophet is told to symbolize the siege of Jerusalem by physically creating a clay model of the city of Jerusalem, and then the Babylonian siege works against the city. So ramps and towers and all that good stuff. And he also has to lay on his side for a certain amount of days and put the model on him for a certain amount of days. It's all really interesting. He had to ration out food supplies, really humble food supplies, and God actually told him, okay, also as a sign of how desperate times are, I want you to use human waste as fuel for the fire. Burn the human waste and cook your food over that. And to that, Ezekiel resists. He pushes back. I've never done that. That would make me ceremonially unclean and impure. And God relents and says, okay, you can use animal dung, which was a relatively common, fuel source. Ezekiel chapter 5. So you're probably noticing that Ezekiel is doing a lot of physical things. He was a very physical prophet. Ezekiel chapter 5, he has to physically shave his head and beard and divide the hair into 3 parts. The first third, he's told to burn. The second third, he is told to cut up with a sword. And then the third, he scatters to the wind outside of the city and blows it all around. But he's also told from those, save just a few hairs and tuck them into the folds of your garment to save them. But then pluck out a few and burn those few. All of these instructions are symbolic of what was going to happen to the population of Jerusalem, right? Some of them are going to be burned in the city. Some of them are going to be killed by the sword outside of the city. And some of them are going to be taken into captivity. Others, there's like a select remnant that he's going to keep, and some of them are going to go in the fire. It's really interesting when you get into it and you look at Ezekiel chapter 5. Okay, Ezekiel chapter 6. He continues this prophecy against Israel, but this time the prophecies are directed against the mountains of Israel, against the high places that people went to burn incense, and they built altars and shrines on these high places on top of mountains and hills. And all of these are going to be smashed. That's what the prophecies are about. These are going to be smashed. Ezekiel, as a result of this, is told to stamp his feet, to strike his hands together, to mourn, and to wail out, alas, because of all of these prophecies. So another physical thing. As he's giving these prophecies, he then begins to physically mourn in front of the people. Ezekiel chapter 7. So this is God in first person explaining and poetically describing the destruction of Judah. And verse 20 and 21 I found really interesting, so I thought I'd share it with you. It says this: They took pride in their beautiful jewelry and used it to make their detestable idols. They made it into vile images. Therefore, I will make it a thing unclean for them. I will give their wealth as plunder to foreigners and as loot to the wicked of the earth who will defile it. So, the idea here is irony, right? The thing that the Judeans loved and tainted themselves with the false worship of, their jewelry and their gold, their precious metals that they made idols out of. That is going to be the thing. The very thing that they valued the most is going to be the thing that ultimately brings their destruction, because then an enemy army is going to completely destroy them to get that loot, right? The spoils of war were a huge motivator in the ancient world. I mean, still today. Ezekiel chapter 8. So Ezekiel gets taken by the hair in another vision, transported by his hair. I mean, is it just me, or does Ezekiel have the most interesting travel methods in the Bible? The most interesting, I mean, he's traveling in a vision, so he's not physically traveling anywhere, but it's still really interesting. He gets carried by the chariot throne of God, and then he gets lifted up by his hair. Interesting. So he gets taken to the Jerusalem temple, again in a vision, and he sees this unnamed idol. So he knows what the idol is. His contemporaries probably know what the idol is, but it's not listed in the Bible. It's not named in the Bible. So the people had put up an idol in God's temple, and then he's shown things that God says, these things that will drive me from my sanctuary. So he's getting kicked out of his own temple. So they had decorated the inside of the temple with animals or insects, and there are a few more idols inside the actual temple proper itself. Then Ezekiel is shown women just outside of the temple mourning for Tammuz, which was a type of worship of a god his death was mourned yearly at the end of the summer when all the plants died. So it was about, keeping the cycle of vegetation going. So whether these women were worshiping God, the God of the Bible, as Tammuz, and so they were guilty of kind of intermingling religious ideas, or maybe they were just worshiping Tammuz and knew that he really had nothing to do with God and they just didn't care. We're not sure. Then Ezekiel is shown men bowing to the sun, so worshiping the sun or the sun god. Again, we're not sure if they're just blatantly worshiping the sun god or if they've mixed and intermingled religious ideas. Ezekiel chapter 9. So still in this vision, God has his servants, so these, spiritual beings, mark the foreheads of everyone in Jerusalem who was mourning over all of this idolatry that was going on. They didn't want it to happen. And they will be spared destruction and death. But everyone else is to be killed indiscriminately. Men, women, and children. Now, this is a really brutal picture, but we have to realize what this vision is talking about. This is a vision about what the Babylonians will do to Jerusalem and why God is sanctioning it, why he's allowing it to happen. The Babylonians will indiscriminately and brutally murder everyone once the siege of Jerusalem is over. That's just their MO. That's just what they did. But what God is saying here specifically to Ezekiel is that those who are faithful to him, those who knew that it wasn't the right thing to do and they were mourning over it, the idolatry, they were going to be spared. And this happens partly through that first exile that Ezekiel was part of, but also partially through God's miraculous provision that we get to see with Baruch and Jeremiah, for example. Okay, Ezekiel chapter 10, after this sort of cleansing of the temple and Jerusalem, God's presence leaves the temple. And Ezekiel again describes these cherubim, these 4 living creatures attached to the throne of God, kind of carrying the throne of God. Ezekiel chapter 11, God brings Ezekiel to the east gate of the temple where there were 25 men, leaders of Jerusalem, giving the people of Jerusalem really bad is not enough, evil advice. And God has Ezekiel prophesy against these men. And as he begins to speak prophecies against these men, one of them actually drops dead in the vision. And at that, Ezekiel stops what he's doing. He falls on his face before God and cries out to him basically, please stop. He says, alas, sovereign Lord, will you completely destroy the remnant of Israel? And then God promises that he's going to bring back scattered Israelites to come and take away the remaining idolatry in the land. So there is going to be a remnant. He just encourages Ezekiel about that. God's presence then leaves not only the temple, but Jerusalem itself and comes to rest on the Mount of Olives. Ezekiel chapter 12. So here again, the prophet acts something out. He acts out the exile, and then he explains to the people what's going to happen. He even prophesies what's going to happen to King Zedekiah, which is one of the more brutal things to happen to a king of Jerusalem. He talks about how, he calls him the prince in this chapter, about how he's going to try to escape. He's going to crawl through the wall of Jerusalem, but he will be caught and he will be brought to Babylon, but he won't see Babylon, even though he's going to live there. And we know, because we've already read the history of Jerusalem falling, that Zedekiah's eyes were gouged out by Nebuchadnezzar. So this prophecy makes a lot of sense. God tells Ezekiel that as he's drinking and eating, he needs to be trembling and shuddering and shaking. And he needs to tell people that he's doing this because the people of Judah and Jerusalem will eat in anxiety and drink in fear because of all the violence that is going to start to happen around them. He's also told, this is going to happen soon. You're not going to have to wait to see this prophecy's fulfillment. It's going to happen really soon. Ezekiel chapter 13. We're pushing through. This is a lot like Jeremiah, where God talked to Jeremiah about the false prophets that were among the people. So Ezekiel is told to prophesy against the false prophets. Prophets who are prophesying lies and delusions. And they're saying the Lord declares and then expects the Lord to fulfill their words. This should scare us a little bit, I think. It should sober us when it comes to biblical prophecy. I want to read that in verse 6. Their visions are false and their divinations a lie. Even though the Lord has not sent them, they say, the Lord declares and expects him to fulfill their words. Prophecy is real. Old Testament prophecy is real. New Testament prophecy is real. I do believe that the New Testament very clearly teaches that the gift of prophecy is a thing. But man, do we have to be careful. Are we declaring things and just expecting God to fulfill our words? The arrogance of that is just astounding. Okay, then Ezekiel chapter 13 speaks against a specific group of women prophets. Now, remember, there were real godly women prophets, but there were also false women prophets. He speaks to the ones who were also talking about visions. They were doing divinations just like the other false prophets. But these women specifically were also dealing in magic charms, in amulets for good luck and protection. And these are actually widely known from the ancient world. So apparently there was Judean women prophets doing this as well. Ezekiel chapter 14. So the elders of Israel, exiles of Israel, I guess, come to Ezekiel in real life, apparently asking for advice or a message from God or something, and God rejects them because he says they have set up idols in their hearts. And he says to Ezekiel, should I let them inquire of me at all? And he calls them out. He has Ezekiel call them out for setting up idols in their hearts. So maybe they don't actually have a physical idol in their home or in their city, but they've got idols in their hearts. God rejects them for this reason, and this chapter turns into a cry for all of the exiled Israelites to reject idolatry and turn back to God. Ezekiel chapter 15, this one's short and sweet. The people in Jerusalem are compared to the wood of a vine, which is useful for nothing except as fuel for a fire. Ezekiel chapter 16, Jerusalem, meaning like the physical city, the actual structure of Jerusalem, is envisioned as a child of an Amorite father and a Hittite mother. So these are the people groups who originally founded Jerusalem. Remember, like King David didn't make Jerusalem. He conquered Jerusalem and took it over. So it goes back to the origins, right? Amorite father, Hittite mother. But God sets up this imagery. The city as a baby was just left exposed to the elements, still with the umbilical cord attached, still covered in blood, crying, just abandoned. And God saw it and said to it, live, and helped it grow up. So eventually God started a covenant relationship with the city. He redeemed it. He married it. And he washed the blood off the city. He gave the city the very best food, clothing, put a crown on her head, and her fame spread. But instead of honoring God, she used that fame to become a prostitute, to spurn the covenant that she had with God and actually revel in the fact that she was doing that, even sacrificing her children to idols. And the alliances that Jerusalem made, it's called out now, that the kings of Jerusalem made, so David's descendants, these alliances that they made with Babylon and Assyria and Egypt, they're envisioned as adulterous affairs. And these affairs, this prostitution, is called out as it's so stupid, it's so dumb, because it's not even profiting the city. In fact, the city is paying other people for her to prostitute herself with. They didn't even need the money because God would have provided the money. So it was just prostitution for prostitution's sake, adultery for adultery's sake. So this is the reason, this is the stated reason for her rejection and her punishment. but the chapter ends with hope, how she will be redeemed again from God when she realizes her ways. Ezekiel chapter 17. All right, if this chapter is confusing to you, that is because it is supposed to be. It is a riddle. It's supposed to be challenging, but God does give a basic answer to this riddle later on in the chapter. So here's how I understand it. The first part of the riddle is that there's two eagles in a vine. So the first eagle plucks the top of a cedar tree and takes it away. Then he plants a seedling of the land in fertile soil, and it sprouts and becomes a low spreading vine rather than a tree, right? It should have become a tree because it was a tree sprout, but it doesn't. So the first eagle is Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, and he plucks the top of a cedar. That cedar is the dynasty of David, so the kings of Jerusalem. And that very top of it that the eagle plucks off was the King Jehoiachin, who just came to the throne, and Nebuchadnezzar goes, nope, and takes him off the throne and brings him to Babylon. All right. So the seedling then that first eagle plants in the fertile ground of Jerusalem is King Zedekiah. But rather than continuing the dynasty of David, becoming a tree, growing up into that big cedar tree, he becomes a low spreading vine because he rebels against Nebuchadnezzar and the people go into exile. So the people spread out along the ground rather than growing high from Jerusalem. Okay? I hope you're still with me. Then there's this second eagle that shows up, and the spreading vine on the ground begins to grow towards this other eagle, and even the roots, its roots that were in the ground, come up out of the ground and begin to go towards this eagle. And God asks the question, will the vine thrive this way? With the obvious answer being no. If its roots are out of the ground, it's going to thirst to death, right? So the second eagle is the Pharaoh of Egypt that King Zedekiah and the rest of the people turn to for help. They turned to for help, but it was all for nothing because Egypt couldn't ultimately help them. This chapter ends positively with God himself picking a shoot, a cedar shoot, and planting it in Israel, and it grows into a mighty tree. So this attaches onto the prophecies of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Zechariah of the branch prophecies, the shoot prophecies that's talking about the Messiah coming from the line of David. So talking about Jesus Christ. Ezekiel chapter 18, just a couple more chapters and we're done this week. Apparently the people in Jerusalem were complaining that God was punishing them for the sins of their fathers. It's not our fault that you're punishing us, God. It's just because our fathers were evil. Stop punishing us for their sin. So God corrects this thinking in Ezekiel chapter 18. He's punishing them for their sins. He clarifies the one who sins is the one who will die. So it's true that the fathers of this people had set them up to fail. They had introduced them to idolatry. They had already really messed up the religious structure and the culture of the day. But God gave these people true prophets. He gave them his word and situations that were designed to get their attention and to call them back to him. So we will all answer for our own actions. It's not enough to blame our life circumstances. God is trying to get a hold. He tried to get a hold of Israel. He's trying to get a hold of us. So we're going to be judged for our responses and our reactions to God and the situations that he puts into our lives to get us to respond to him. Then at the end of this chapter, there's a call to repent and live. So this chapter is meant to be convicting, to challenge us in our thinking, to challenge Israel in her thinking. Ezekiel chapter 19 is a lament. So it's a song of mourning that Ezekiel would have sung to everyone around him, which is interesting to think about, isn't it? I would like to hear it. I would like to hear the prophet Ezekiel sing. I mean, not about me, but I'd like to hear this. You know what I mean? Okay, so it's a lament for the kings of Jerusalem. So first for Jehoahaz, the king who just became king, and then he was taken to Egypt. And then a lament for either Jehoiachin or Zedekiah, who both were taken to Babylon. So this is a lament for them. I think it's probably for Jehoiachin, but I could be wrong. I might adjust my views. I have to go back and look at it more carefully. Ezekiel chapter 20. This is the last chapter we're looking at today, guys. So the elders of the people are apparently brave enough to come to Ezekiel again, because they do in real life. And again, God rejects them for the whole idol in their heart situation. And God has Ezekiel confront them with the sins of their ancestors. So here's how ancestor sin is quite helpful. He goes back through the history of Israel's rebellion against God and then asks the elders, now what are you going to do? Are you going to do the same sins as your ancestors? Or are you going to repent and change? Very depressingly, at the very end of the chapter, Ezekiel says, Sovereign Lord, they're saying of me, isn't he just telling parables? So essentially, like, he's interesting to listen to. He may be good to learn some things from, but these aren't really direct prophecies against us. So it really sounds like the elders and the people were just looking at him and they were finding ways to get around having to change. They were finding ways to excuse their behavior, which sounds really familiar if you're a human living on planet Earth, because that is what we do. But that is what we fight against. We come to God and he can overcome our unwillingness if we're willing at all. God's grace and mercy can do that for us. All right, we're done. We are done for this week. Lots to cover. There was a lot of interesting imagery in Ezekiel. If you have any questions about what you read, like always, pop it in the comments below. It's my son's birthday this weekend. Well, actually on Monday, but he's turning 2, so we're having a little family birthday for him. So I may be a bit busy this week. I know I was busy last week too. I didn't get to many of the comments, but hopefully I will be able to early week or midweek. But anyway, I really enjoy reading your comments and I always respond when I can. All right, guys, I'll see you later.